Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, I'm so excited to have y'all here. Thank you so much for joining this conversation. I have been looking forward to this moment for weeks because I have here two incredible women that are going to put a whole new, beautiful, generally not exposed lens on this issue of climate and opportunity and communities and policies that really move us forward within the business context. So I will go ahead and introduce these two incredible women who I'm sure you'll learn to adore very shortly. Jenna Nicholas is CEO of Impact Experience, which builds bridges between impact investors, philanthropists, innovators, and leaders of marginalized communities, linking vision with action and directing investments to the most vulnerable communities. Jenna is the president of Phoenix Global Impact, a firm that specializes in impact investing, social entrepreneurship, and strategic philanthropy. Through her firm, she's managed Diverse Invest Philanthropy, a coalition of foundations divesting from investments in fossil fuels and reinvesting in new economy solutions. She's also worked with the World Bank, Treasury. There's so much more I could say about her. She's a World Economic Forum Global Shaper, a Forbes 30 Under 30. She just is an all-around incredible human being that is
A slacker.
What have you done with your life, Jenna? And next to her, we have a wonderful, brilliant friend of mine, Nathalie Molina Niño, who is an impact investor and tech globalization veteran focused on high growth businesses that benefit women and the planet. She's the author of Leapfrog, the new revolution for women entrepreneurs. She launched her first tech startup at the age of 20.
5 years ago.
I was gonna say 5.5, but I'm so glad she corrected me. She also co-founded the Entrepreneurs at Athena. She's the co-founder of Entrepreneurs at Athena at the Athena Center for Leadership Studies at Barnard College at Columbia University, where she continues to serve as an advisor. Prior to her career in impact investing, she spent 15 years advising organizations like Disney, Microsoft, MTV, Mattel, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. During that time, she co-led and launched the growth of a multinational business in Lionbridge into a $1 million operation in over 30 countries.
100 million. Let's skip the crazy bio, especially since it's dating me.
But you are so beyond impressive. I want to make sure that these people understand the presence in which they've entered. Well, I am beyond thrilled to be your moderator for this session and to have this conversation with you. Your bios speak volumes, but more than that, your body of work and your intelligence and what you've done in this area is something I hope that we can translate to this network of folks that are here for Smart Cities. So let's get started. The conversation is climate. Everywhere we look, everybody's talking about climate. Oftentimes, it's not based in science. It's based in fear. It's based in the misunderstanding of what the issue is and what the solutions are out there. It was once a distant concern, but climate is now an existential threat and the greatest challenge facing a generation. It is a threat magnifier. If there's a potential of war, it magnifies that. If there's a marginalized community anywhere, it magnifies that. And those that are least responsible are bearing a lying share of the brunt. Jenna, you have worked in building bridges and connecting these communities, taking public-private partnerships to a new level that allows for investments in these communities that are feeling the brunt and have been left behind. Tell us a little bit more about the work that you do there and why this is important in confronting the climate challenge.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here today with all of you. So exactly as Tolu mentioned, a big part of our work at Impact Experience is really how do we ensure that as we're thinking about the huge issues around climate change, that we're actually engaging in communities that are at the front line of bearing the brunt of the global ramifications of this shift that's taking place. And actually, I'd like to do a call out to Erica Holloman, who's here, who works with the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, and just one incredible organization that is based within community doing grassroots work that I think so often when we have these conversations, we're not focused on people like Erica and the importance of highlighting that work. So our work at Impact Experience, whether it's here in Atlanta where we're working around the transition to 100% renewable energy and ensuring that there's a lens around racial and climate justice as part of that work, or in southern West Virginia around retraining former coal miners, or in Puerto Rico and Houston post the hurricanes there, when we see, particularly post-hurricanes, and we're seeing this with Hurricane Dorian right now, that the effects of natural disasters, the impact of them on the most marginalized is aggrandized at those times. And so the importance as we're engaging in this work of highlighting that and ensuring that as we're engaging investors and entrepreneurs, that the voices that are elevated are the voices within community. So that's really the essence of much of our work.
I love that, because a lot of the conversations around climate also centers around saving the planet and not so much around people. But, it's like, save the planet, save the planet. The planet's gonna be fine. The planet will continue to be here with or without us. The goal is to make sure that we protect our way of life in a higher form of our way of life. And so people are at the core of this issue. Nathalie, your work and your career really has been around elevating narratives around people that are not often heard, around women, around communities of color that have been left behind economically, that have been left behind by our social justice systems. When it comes to climate, what do you see is the most lost opportunity in addressing this challenge?
Yeah, I think I would compliment and I would add to some of what Jenna was saying is that we think about who's on the front lines and whose already marginalized position is exacerbated by climate. But what I think that we sometimes don't do enough of, and certainly now with my time in finance, this has become really clear to me, is that the solutions are also in the hands of those same people. So for those that are familiar with all things climate, you have definitely read, and for those who are not, you must read a book called Drawdown. 80% of that book was written by an Atlantan, an amazing Oxford doctorate who has spent her life on climate and specifically the intersection of gender and climate. And in Catherine's research, and she also did an amazing TED Talk that anyone would enjoy watching, she positions women and the issues around gender as not just the community that is potentially most victimized by climate, but also the community in whose hands most solutions actually are, right? It turns out that when you rank the top 100 solutions that are available today, meaning technologies that already exist, not experimental things that are going to take 10 years to develop, but things that exist right here today, and you rank them by effectiveness, 2 of the top 10 center on gender, involving educating women and girls, involving reproductive health, involving all of the things that we can move the lever on that we oftentimes don't connect with gender. So it turns out, the framing of, yes, potential victimization by climate, but also it turns out the superpower and it turns out the one, right, most effective key to turning the tide on climate is women.
There's this wonderful quote by Marie Robinson that says, "Climate change is a man-made problem with a feminist solution." That's just the embodiment of what you've just said. Looking to cities, policymakers, looking to building those bridges that you've been working on, can you talk to us about strategies that connect the public sector, the private sector, individuals that can help us lead to better policies? Are there any projects that you've worked on that would illustrate how when you bring those communities together, you really can move the needle on climate and do so in an inclusive way and a financially beneficial way?
Definitely. And I think, and there was a panel yesterday around opportunity zones, and I think opportunity zones is a very interesting example of this, where there's obviously many challenges that could come about as a result of, and for those of you who don't know, that the opportunity zone legislation that came out last year that basically means if you invest into historically underinvested in communities, you get a capital gains write-off. And so there's a lot of interest from investors in investing in communities that have been historically underinvested in. But there's a big risk that this could just gentrify communities and perpetuate many of the challenges that already exist. And that it won't be engaged from the perspective that Nathalie was talking about, that the solutions lying within the communities, but actually the preconceived notions of investors coming in from outside. So the importance, I think, particularly right now around these public-private partnerships and working with local mayors' offices. And so we've been working, for example, in Arizona in collaboration with the people from the mayor's office there, but also Arizona State University, and in particular the head of tribal affairs there, of looking at in the construction of investment opportunities, ensuring that there's strong engagement from the local Navajo and Hopi communities and the Latino communities in the construction of investments, actually many of which are focused on climate resiliency solutions. And so the power of both engaging local practitioners and leaders and policymakers with also national funders in the process of driving forward those investments is sort of one example, I think, of a number of ways in which we can kind of really lead from the community outwards.
And Nathalie, how do we inject investments into those communities? Like, you're an impact investor. What do you do? How do you make the argument that, listen, this is an important place for you to focus your investment? Is it, first loss capital? Like, what are the strategies that are out there to make sure the right investments get into the right hands?
Right. Everyone loves to call me an impact investor. I'm an investor, and I'm a little sharky at that. I tend to shy away from the term impact because it tends to give people the impression that it's lower returns, it's concessionary returns. And I think especially, I invest in a number of different areas, and climate and infrastructure is one of them, but especially in this category, I really want to emphasize that we have gotten to a point now where investing in technologies that reverse climate change is actually more profitable than technologies that cause climate change. And this is something that just, I think, gets lost when we talk about things like first loss capital, and we talk about things like investing with concessionary returns, and we give people the impression that investing in things that reverse climate change is the right thing to do. But then you have situations, and I'm going to get this wrong because it was either CalPERS or CalSTRS, but the community involved in one of the largest pension funds in the world, right, recently went to the board and said, enough with all of this ESG investing. We just want you to take good care of our money and make sure that you're getting the highest returns. Once again, conflating this idea and confusing and basically saying that in order to make the greatest returns, we're just gonna have to trash the environment, as if the two were somehow mutually exclusive, right? And I think that's the paradigm that has to shift. And so when I describe what sort of investing I do, I focus on outcomes over optics. I think that in the world of impact investing, in the world of ESG, we see a lot of things that look good on people's annual reports. If you're investing in women, you see a whole lot of pink logos and curly Q fonts, but not necessarily things that actually move the dial for women or move the dial on climate. And I think that what I want people to focus on is focus on outcomes over optics. And to me, that means looking at things that are available right now. Having come from tech, I'm a recovering tech entrepreneur. In Silicon Valley especially, there's really a focus on new technology. And the reality is in 2009, Google X launched their autonomous vehicle project. It is 2019. Please raise your hand if you got here in an autonomously driven vehicle. Nobody. No. But which one? Okay, one. There's always one. Thank you. It takes a long time for technology, new technology, to become commercial and to scale. We don't have that kind of time. And the good news is that, again, Project Drawdown and other research shows us that the technology is actually already here. And it might not be sexy, and as an investor, you're not going to make it to the cover of Wired magazine because you invested in something that's already existed for the last 10 years. But this isn't about sexy. This is about what is available right here, right now. And one of the projects that I love is FullCycle, founded by a friend of I think, many of us, Ibrahim al-Husseini, who's an Palestinian refugee turned entrepreneur turned investor who also came to the same conclusion and said, we really have to focus on investing in the technologies that are available right now. And P.S., if we do that, those technologies are also de-risked. they're also incredible investments that you can get amazing returns on. So I just think, for me, that's the most important thing is, yes, first loss capital has always existed. Philanthropy has always existed. The role of that category of investing and philanthropy has not changed. It has a purpose, but for those of us that are doing just straight up investing, it really is about shifting gears and realizing that we can actually make more money by doing the right thing. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive.
I like that. I like that. And in our world, we know that change does not come from the top down. It has to go from the bottom up, especially change that is seen as by some people as not politically beneficial to them. Just because, not because of the science. Science is indisputable. As an engineer, I tried many times to negotiate with science. Does not work. You can ask my organic chemistry teacher. That C will stand. But in climate, we often see that where we need those policies to be able to kind of really rev the engine of change, of moving us forward in the right direction. So business is playing its part in some areas. People are suffering and pushing and moving. How do we get business, people, to really work together to make sure that those that for some ungodly reason still believe that climate-friendly policies may not be in their political interest, how do we get them to a point where they realize that it is? Just like we've done in many cases with business, how do we do that with governments?
I think a big part of it is actually taking the step back to actually see more of what connects us rather than divides us. You know, part of what's been so interesting about this work we've been engaged in West Virginia over the past 5 years, and this is a community, Williamson, West Virginia, where they have incredibly high rates of diabetes, obesity, drug offense rates, but related to this conversation, you know, many laid off coal miners and many coal mines that are now looking at repurposing. And one of the things that's been so interesting, I remember our first time bringing a group there, and we had this Silicon Valley investor, this woman who'd spent her life fighting for environmental causes. And in the group, we had a former coal miner, and then we also had policymakers. But this former coal miner, we start all of our gatherings with our impact experiences, everybody's sharing a symbol or an object that has significance to them. And this coal miner shared a piece of coal, and he talked about how, for him, coal wasn't just about a job, but it was about his identity and his American citizen. And it was fascinating. You know, you mentioned, I'd spent so much of my life sort of building this coalition of foundations that were divesting from fossil fuels and investing in new economy solutions. And both for myself and for this woman who invested in renewable energy technologies, you know, had never actually met a coal miner. And so when we're thinking about designing these policies, how do we actually come back to that place of what is that common humanity? And so then the effectiveness of the solutions that can be built from that place rather than all of our preconceived notions. And you know, a lot of our work is around implicit bias, and similar to what Nathalie was describing around the importance of framing this as actually there's incredible economic opportunities here. I think it's a similar question around investing in women and people of color, around businesses more broadly, and as it relates to renewable energy as well, where there's often this preconceived notion that you have to accept lower returns from investing in women and people of color, where actually the data shows that often you actually get greater returns from investing in women and people of color. So I think the importance, whether it's around how we engage in communities, whether it's how we design policies, whether it's how we invest, of both recognizing the biases that are influencing that decision making and being able to start to shift as we think about that.
I would just add that from a policy standpoint, the oil and gas industry and extractive industries generally are helped by policy today in what is clearly not a free market, right? They stand and they compete based on heavily subsidized, you know, ecosystems that make it categorically unfair, right? You cannot compare apples and oranges. And so I think that if policymakers were to commit to actually having all of these technologies compete in a fair, open market, we would find that the shift that we're already seeing will accelerate. It's happening anyway, with or without the help of policymakers, because we're not going to hold our breath waiting for that to happen, but it will accelerate if policymakers step up and allow the extractive technologies to compete in the free market like everyone else.
I want to touch on the notion of implicit bias. when we use the word invest and investment, when it's attached to a corporation, a non-human entity, it's a positive, mostly. The relationship is oftentimes a return on investment, something coming back, something being given, whether it's a seed being planted, something will grow, something will come back. However, when we attach the word invest to people, particularly to women and people of color, all of a sudden there is a negative connotation. All of a sudden there is this feel of, I am dumping money in a barrel and we'll never see it again. What is that about? Like, do we have to work on our language? You've written kind of about how language affects how we think and how we work and how we look at people, and you've had to do that in connecting communities. Help us understand what this is when it comes to investing and appreciating people.
I could give you the really short answer. It's just bias. The broader answer is probably helped by a study that actually Illumine Capital recently published, I think just in the last month, with the Spark Lab at Stanford. And I think this is interesting because what it shows us is something that, for me, on one hand, one part of the research, not that surprising. It was similar to the study that Sheryl Sandberg included in her book, Lean In, where they took business cases in an MBA class, and they just changed the first name, right? So it was like Harry versus Holly or something. And everyone wanted to work for Harry, and everybody thought Holly was, uppity, right? This is a similar kind of thing, but they did it with fund managers. So, and I tie this to climate because at the end of the day, where we channel our money, whether it's to individuals or companies or climate change, is ultimately dictated by who is managing our money, right? And we have had the same tiny segment of the population controlling 98% of the total, equities market. And so in this case, what this study showed is that, yes, if you take, for example, a black fund manager, a black male fund manager, and you have his rate of return and all of his numbers be apples to apples, exactly the same in a competitive market, the asset allocators, so think the people managing your endowments at the colleges that you went to, the pension funds, the 401ks, right, the ones who decide who manages these funds, they look at comparisons and they will have bias towards, yes, people of color and women. Simple bias, nothing surprising there. What was surprising about the study for me is that if you take that same person of color who is a fund manager and you have them overperform, meaning above market, meaning they are knocking it out of the ballpark, they are performing like rock stars, the bias, which is to say the skepticism, increases. How is it possible that a woman or a person of color could be knocking it out of the ballpark? And the skepticism is so high that it actually makes a meaningful material difference in where money gets allocated, which is why less than 2% of all the global markets are currently managed by fund managers who identify as women or people of color. So if we were to shift that, if we were to have people at the table, different people with different perspectives, with different, education, background, et cetera, managing where our hard-earned money goes, I think that we would see this shift, and we would also see that the paradigm of investing in corporations is somehow beneficial, but investing in people is not. The numbers objectively disagree with that. And I think about Larry Fink, I think about the big asset allocators who, in the case of BlackRock, own and manage over, 20% of the world's money. And I think there are a lot of letters being written to shareholders about what we should be doing with our money, but there's not a whole lot of action, and the dial isn't moving on these numbers. But if we did move it, I think that we would have a much easier case to be made, because not only would the numbers and the research tell us, but our money, our pensions, our retirements would be showing what a good proposition it is, not just to invest in people, but to invest in climate. And I think until people feel it in their wallets, it's not going to feel real.
Yeah, and just to add to that, and I have the pleasure of investing in Illumine Capital, and a co-founder of ours at Impact Experience, and being involved in this research over the past few years, it's been so fascinating, even the choice of language. So we chose to talk about it as financial disparities in investing rather than bias in investing, because of the triggering language of even saying bias, right? And so it's fascinating about how do you lower the barriers to entry for people to even engage in the conversation that we're having right now. And so part of actually the requirement for this fund of fund at Lumen Capital is to actually have their fund managers and portfolio companies engage in impact experiences as part of their debiasing work, because of the power and the term that Brian Stevenson talks about of proximity, of creating those opportunities for proximity. So whether it's, we've been taking groups to Brian Stevenson's the Equal Justice Initiative Lynching Memorial Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, as part of actually realizing that we're all operating within a system of structural racism, and that unless we actually engage around that and recognize that, our ability to make decisions, whether it's at a policy level, whether it's at an investing level, is going to be nowhere near as effective unless we realize the system that we're operating within.
And the language here is really important, because what you're saying is it is your fiduciary duty, the managers of these massive sums of capital, to make your shareholders more money and to increase your returns. And you're leaving money on the table.
Yeah. Climate change is an issue of justice. We cannot have a just and equitable world if we do not look at the root causes of climate change and who is directly affected. My absolute favorite African proverb says, "Until the lion learns to write, all the stories will glorify the hunter." We need to teach the lion to write. We need to change the narrative. We need to move the money. And some of that is individuals. Some of that are working with corporations, and some of that is working with policymakers. It's going to take a village. It really is going. We didn't all contribute to this problem, but we cannot get to a solution without all investing and figuring out exactly how to get through it. This conversation could go on forever. I'm truly learning and having a fantastic time with you two. But since we do have to wrap up, I just want to throw it back to each of you quickly. Some final thoughts on this. Climate can be an issue that is really, it can be gut-wrenching, complicated. It can be elitist, where you don't feel like you don't necessarily have agency to speak to it. What would you tell the people here today that are investors, business leaders, mayors from major cities? What is 1-2 things that they could start to do to shift kind of where we are on this issue? Because we need to shift, and we need to shift quickly. What would be your advice?
2 things. Catherine Wilkinson, the researcher that I mentioned, who's here based in Atlanta, has started something called #WomenLeadClimate. If you follow that hashtag on Twitter or anyone else, you will see voices of women, and especially women of color, who are changing the narrative on climate, centering all of the things that we are saying here need to be centered in that conversation. You will find that illuminating on multiple levels. And then the other thing is, Ibrahim Al-Husseini from FullCycle always says, now is better than new. And I would just say, keep that in mind in everything that you're doing, whether it's investing, whether it's philanthropy, whether it is policy work. Now is better than new when it comes to climate change.
And adding off Catherine Wilkinson with the Project Drawdown, as Nathalie mentioned, there's a number of very tangible, practical things that we can each do in terms of thinking about our own consumption, how much we fly, what we eat, the life choices that we make. And it makes me think about, there's a quotation from the Baha'i writings that says, "A human being's inner life molds the environment and is deeply affected by it. The one acts upon the other, and every abiding change in the life of man is the result of these mutual interactions." So thinking about those daily decisions that we each make in all of the roles that we operate within, as being such an important part of this conversation. So thank you.
I love that. Thank you so much. And I will just take my moderator privilege to share very quickly about the work that I do at the United Nations, which is focused on helping individuals, like you said, make those individual choices, change behavior. So I run the United Nations Climate Action Campaign called ActNow, which helps you to start thinking about the actions that you take in your daily lives. What are small things that you can do to start to shift how you relate to your environment in terms of climate? How do you make climate-conscious decisions every day? The campaign is built around the tool called our ActNow bot that recommends 10 actions that each of us can take every single day to confront the climate challenge. So whether it's taking 5-minute showers, whether it's eating less meat, whether it's driving less, recycling, etc., the tool will help you recognize those areas that you could today be taking an opportunity to affect the climate crisis, help you track your progress, and also show you how many people around the world are doing the exact same thing. And I think that's such a powerful thing to be able to see that across the world, 200,000 people are also taking these actions, are also moving the needle. And once we change habit, once we change behavior, we can change corporations. And with moving the money, we can change policies and hopefully get to a much better place and quicker than the science is telling us that we have to. Thank you both so much for this incredible conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.